Hello, I'm Walker, one of the summer interns here at the Seward House Museum, and I'm here to bring you the final installment of Table Talk. Now, what is Table Talk? Table Talk was a series of observations, thoughts, and kind of just general stuff that Mr. Seward would write down. It was collected in his autobiography, which was written by his son, Fred. I kind of think of them as the social media posts of the day because they cover a wide variety of topics about a bunch of different things, but for the most part, they're more witty and well thought out than most tweets I've seen. So we're going to talk about Seward. He's kind of at the end of his life at this point. He's retired in Auburn, and like a lot of older people near the end of his life, he's reflecting on how things have changed before him. So a lot of that long life was spent in politics, so it's only natural that he'd reflect a lot on his political career. Seward had a long political career, almost 40 years in public service. So on July 7th, he gave an appraisal of the American people. He said, "I have great reliance on the good sense of the American people." He did qualify this, though. He said that various excitements, such as the Know Nothing movement and the secession movement, kind of shook his faith in the American people's good sense. Now, the Know Nothing movement was a political movement that was anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. It was a social movement and a political party, and they held a lot of power in New York State in the 1840s and 1850s, and they were actually part of the reason he was denied the 1860 nomination. And the secession movement, of course, is the southern states seceding after Lincoln was elected because they were afraid that Lincoln would end slavery in their territories. Despite these difficulties, Seward thought that returning reason would always come and save the day and push the American people back on the right track. This kind of optimism and faith in the people was one of Mr. Seward's main qualities, and it carried him throughout his political life. Sometimes it served him for the good, sometimes for the bad, but it was always something that carried him through, and especially carried him through the Civil War. He needed that optimism. Now, his political life wasn't the only thing that changed. Industry in the general face of America changed a lot since Mr. Seward was born. On July 17th, he triumphantly announced, "Auburn has now attained street railways and pavements. Towns seldom go backwards after reaching that point. I know of but two in the United States that have done so." Now, the railways that he's talked about being in the Auburn streets were one of the biggest changes that Seward experienced in his life. He was born in 1801 when America was primarily rural. It was all rural, it was all farms. He was born under the administration of Thomas Jefferson, the great champion of the American farmer. And by 1872, when Seward was writing this Table Talk, railways were crisscrossing America, and America was on its way to becoming the industrial power it was in the 20th century. Railroads didn't really start getting prominence in America until the 1830s, when Mr. Seward himself would have been in his early 30s. Now, Mr. Seward was a big champion of industry and the railroads in general, but industry didn't always go the way he wanted. It wasn't always a good thing in his mind, even though for the most part he supported it. On July 11th, he lamented that what a wealth of fruit is wasted here every year. He goes on to explain how strawberries and cherries would rot on the vine because there wasn't enough people to pick them. And why wasn't there enough people to pick them? Well, because they had jobs in industry. This area of central New York was very industry-based, and it was very prosperous in this time, and people could make so much more money working in industry jobs like that on the railroads that they weren't willing to take the pay grade to go out in the fields and pick fruit. So Mr. Seward was kind of sad that that kind of change was happening here. Now, don't think he only had his mind on local things and things in the past. His mind wandered all over the place, including around the world. He had just finished his travels, and he gave a lot of advice about how to travel around the world at these table talks. On July 8th, he said, "If I were to travel around the world again, I will go places I haven't seen. I'd much rather go to new places than see old places I've already seen." Now, he gives a lot of travel advice on July 18th. He says, "So you are going around the world. Don't make the mistake of thinking that that is what you are going for." What he means here is don't travel around the world just to say you've traveled around the world. Actually travel around the world to see stuff, to see new experiences. He told his guests that at this time when you're traveling, if you want, you could hop a steamboat to a train to a hotel if you're going somewhere in, like, say, China, and you had this narrow corridor of westernization that you could basically stay in these narrow westernized trains and hotels, and it wouldn't be any different from like hotels at home. So he said, get off that beaten track and travel elsewhere. Now, although Mr. Seward spent a lot of time traveling, a lot of these reflections were about stuff pretty close to home. By this time in 1872, he had retired here to Auburn, and he wasn't going anywhere else. His health was failing. He couldn't walk that well, and his arms had a creeping paralysis that had started when he got in that carriage accident and had been made worse after the assassination attempt, the attempt on his life, that his arms, especially his right arm, were slowly becoming paralyzed. But he stayed here in Auburn. He tried to keep healthy. In fact, he would spend a lot of time out here on this porch. He loved to be outside, and he lays out his personal philosophy of health for us on July 13th. He says, "One half of the philosophy of health, I am inclined to think, consists in living as much as possible out of doors. The deck of a ship is the best cure for seasickness. The piazza of the house, aka where we are right now, is the most wholesome apartment, and no bitters can give such an appetite for breakfast as a short pull in a boat or a short walk on the highway, the most inexpensive of medicines." So Seward would have spent a lot of time out here on his porch looking at his precious gardens. Now, I mentioned pulling in a boat, and by that we mean rowing. He spent a lot of time rowing a boat out at the Seward family home on Owasco Lake, which is actually still in the family. And on these boat rides, Seward would note kind of the curiosities he saw. He and his family knew this one strange old man they called the Ancient Mariner. The Ancient Mariner was, as Seward said, some old man somewhere between 60 and 100 who always was on the lake, and he always sold his fish at the same price, whether he had 3 fish in the boat or 30 fish in the boat. Now, Seward kind of gives a description of this strange Ancient Mariner. He said, "He seems to live on the water, at least he is never seen off it, though he is perpetually picking up boards and driftwood, as he says, to build him a house." It's kind of nice to see there was just as many strange specimens back then as there are today. Now, despite Seward's healthy habits, besides his cigar smoking and brandy drinking, he passed away at the age of 71 in his office inside. And the last entry in his table talks came on July 18th. He passed away in October, but he was just kind of too busy, I guess, to put any more entries in after July. The last entry, quite fittingly, concerns history. And since we are a history museum, I think it's excellent that we end with this. I'd like to read you the quote in full. It's about Seward's view of history. July 18th, 1872. "As nearly as I can trace the history of civilization, it has not been the prerogative or inheritance or work of any one race. One race takes it up and carries it to a certain point, then lapses into stagnation. Another takes it up and carries it on a step further. It marches through one continent at one time, through another in a succeeding era. Different nations in turn become its leaders and exponents. Mankind as a whole profits by it, but only one portion at a time seems capable of assisting its progress." As a student of history, I will say this is a somewhat outdated view of the historical process and how history works. But as for summing up what Seward believes and his personal philosophy, I think it is really excellent and just really brilliant. In some ways, he was very progressive. For example, his idea that more than one nation and more than one people create history and do things at different points, very progressive. A lot of his contemporaries thought history was the story of the white race going from one place to another. Seward didn't believe that. But still very much a man of his time. His ideas that only one nation could carry history forward at one time, that kind of smacks of Western superiority and a lot of imperialism in that thought. So still very much a man of his time. This reflection on history is also a great way to look at Seward's personal life. He's very concerned about stagnation in this quote about history. And in his personal life, Seward always tried not to be stagnant. He always kept moving. Seward always tried to work toward what he thought was progressive. For example, when he was doing his anti-slavery work, working to end slavery, that was very progressive in his mind. And after slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment, he worked to expand the country territorially, with buying Alaska and making overtures to a lot of other places to buy. That was very much in his idea of progress and what would be the good thing to do for the country. Personally, he also never liked to stagnate. He never liked to rest. His motto was "rest is rust." And I think that's a good motto to live by. I'll leave you with that. That's all for our Table Talk series, but stay tuned. We have a lot of good stuff coming up here at the Seward House Museum. August 10th of this year, 2022, we're going to have a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream here in these gardens behind me, so definitely check that out and stay tuned for more programming.